So I've been doing this podcast for just over 3 years and I really want to bring it live for you all. So I'm going to need a favor from you. If you're interested in seeing the SAVVYWALLET podcast live, please register your interest by signing up to my mailing list with the link in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for your support so far.
People will often say, well, I've been doing a habit or I've been doing it this way for so many years. I can never unbreak that. It's too stuck. And actually, that's just a mentality. That's not a fact around neurology. The brain is the most complex thing in the universe. We do believe it is a predictive machine. So it is learning. One of the more major breakthroughs in the past recent decades is that because of something called neuroplasticity, it means that the brain's always molding and changing and taking shape, and it will always be changing and adapting and learning in order to deal with what it has encountered. That is hope. That means that we will always be able to alter our brain. We will always be able to make change. We will always be able to become somebody who we want to be. Most of the New Year's resolutions we set are actually not that rewarding very quickly. But when we're talking about New Year's resolutions, one of the things that I say to people is take whatever that resolution is.
You're not defined by where you come from.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big message that I always want to tell people. Like
you have to be able to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
When you grow up in ends, you don't realize it when you're confident, but you have an audacity to do things that ordinarily most people wouldn't be willing to do.
Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Atto. We have a special guest in the building. We have Dr. Amber Johnston, who's a director at Healthy Mind Psychology. She's also a clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist. Dr. Amber Johnston has been working with patients for about 20 years, specializing in clinical health, pain management, and neuropsychology. Dr. Amber, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Very, very welcome. I'm looking forward to this conversation because it's a different conversation. It's not one that we really had on the podcast, but I think it's going to be very interesting for people. How was your trip into London? I know you don't live in London at the moment.
Filled with stress, but we managed that. We get here a little
You
bit
got
late.
it right. It's very busy though, right? I normally do travel in and out of London sometimes, even within London. It's not always like it's not always pleasant because it can get very busy, but it was a very busy walk up to the studio. I was like,
It really
it's
was.
crazy.
You know what? I am from Houston, Texas, and that is quite far away from the major city of America, New York. And for me, growing up, New York and London were always these kind of big places. And the idea that I now live an hour away from London is extraordinary. So I really try to remember that and just have that positive kind of gratitude moment of actually being really that close as opposed to a 3-hour plane ride to go from Houston to New York. Yeah.
You know what? For some reason, I thought that Houston was, because I always hear great things about Houston. It's, it's amazing. Even like when people talk about like moving to America, they kind of cite Houston as a place. So is it not like a big city? I thought it was a big city type stuff.
It's a massive city. It's become better and better recently. They've put loads of money into it and they've really worked it up to be a really cool place. But if you're asking, New Orleans, it's where I'm born. That is the number one underrated city.
Okay.
It has such culture, such history, such music, art, food.
That's what I heard. The food is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's your place to visit.
Great. So obviously I described you, or I described a part of you, let's say. Who would you say Dr. Amber Johnston is?
Well, I think that I definitely embrace the identity of a psychologist. I mean, it is something that I live and breathe. I have devoted my life up to this point to study. I love to keep learning. It's a lifelong learning pursuit. There's so much more I can be taking in. And then in the meantime, I also, raise a couple kids and a dog and have a husband, those kind of things.
I love that. And walk us through the life experiences that have made you the person you are today.
Oh, we're going deep straight in there.
Straight away.
Goodness. I think this is something that we take time to really try and process over decades of figuring out who we are and how we've gotten to be who we are. And actually, it's incredibly relevant because I think the things that I like to talk about is why the past is so important, because the past builds the brain. What I've kind of learned about myself over time is that when I was young, I had a number of deaths of people who were close to me, unexpected, early deaths, really upsetting things. But the key to it was that there was always somebody close to me who was in more pain, who was closer to, who had the bigger loss. And what I think had happened over some of that time was, as a child, I was kind of protected from it. So I didn't really get a lot of focus on how I was processing, because it wasn't about me. It was about other people. And in doing so, I think I've made a way of processing it by becoming a carer, by a helper. So very quickly, early on, I seemed to want to be the person that was there for somebody else going through something.
Okay.
So, and I was 12 writing Ask Amber columns, and felt the need to really get to know what was going on in the inner worlds of my, small friends.
Yeah. Okay.
And the best that I can think of is actually, I think it's some of those events made me just feel a purpose, and probably that I got something from being somebody's confidant and feeling that I could help or make a difference in somebody's pain. Wow. So I think that's what started this, but I always knew that this was the road I wanted to go down.
Okay.
Neuro is different. I didn't expect that. So I always imagine, you have a beautiful therapy couch right there.
This does feel like a therapy couch, yeah.
That's the perfect Freudian couch there. So yeah, I think that was what I had always envisioned doing. And then as life took me into the direction that it did, I was psychodynamically trained, which means, again, very Freudian, the typical psychoanalysis, the couch, the therapist in the back going, that kind of work.
That's real?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, there's wonderful things about psychodynamic theory. And I am a big Freud supporter. But it was very quickly on that I was like, I need some more tools. I need something else to contribute in the therapy session. So I quickly went into some of the other therapy types like CBT. I ended up wanting to go into corrections, so in prisons and jail settings. And I loved that work. I thought that there was so much opportunity to help people just start to have emotional and coping tools that they had never had exposure to. And so there's a lot of change that was able to be made. But we saw a lot of head injury.
Yeah. Okay.
So a lot of head injury seemed to result in different behaviors that ended up as offenders and coming into the system.
That's interesting. I never thought about that part of it. Yeah.
It's a really big piece. And so that really steered me into neuro work and understanding neuro work. So then I kind of came out of corrections and got into neuro more widely. And you might be wondering what neuropsychology is.
Yes, I am. I've read beforehand because I like to read about it, but definitely do explain what that is for like the watchers and listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So neuropsychology is, let's start with psychology. It's really the study of behavior and our mind. And our thought content. So, asking a lot about people's, emotions and their inner world. But you're really looking at the behavior. And I guess neuropsychology is the concept that you're still doing the same thing. You're looking at thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, but you're looking at it in the lens of neurophysiology or neuroanatomy. So how the changes within the brain structures themselves then create changes in thinking and behavior and emotion state. So most of this is, for the most part, you'll find neuropsychologists working closely with neurologists. They're often in hospital settings. They can be outpatients too. And you are often going to a neuropsychologist if you want to understand how your brain is functioning, particularly post an accident, post an injury, when you've noticed that there's changes in your thinking and behavior. And if you're worried about kind of maybe disease process or dementias, that's where most people end up running into a neuropsychologist.
Okay.
But what I found, and what I just now is my passion, is helping people understand how their brain works, how it actually works, to help them understand how their behaviors and their thoughts and their emotions come into them from more of a healthy place. What is the norm? Or how do we personalize what the norm looks like? And I think there's so much more information that can be incredibly helpful to people when they have that little bit of understanding of this is what your brain is doing.
Yeah.
It's not just all down to your conscious thinking, because most of it isn't.
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting because I feel like I like the fact, I think what definitely drew me to you was the fact that it's almost applying those studies to understand how the brain works, but like you say, from a healthy, I'm doing healthy quotation because I don't know what healthy is, and we'll talk about that, but not from somebody that has had a head injury, so to speak, right? And I feel like having that understanding, because I feel like our actions, I think we feel like we have a lot of control, maybe more control than we think. And actually, maybe through this conversation, maybe we'll understand actually, maybe it's not quite what it is, right? And I don't know what the answer to that is, so I'm looking forward to it. So I wanted to know, right, like, you know, when you are working with patients, right, and they do come in with like head injuries, what does I don't want to say typical treatment plan, but what does a range of treatment plans kind of look like when you're working with patients?
Yeah, so if I were to be on the ward, and again, I haven't been on a hospital ward in a little bit now, but I spent many a day. When you come in, what you're doing is you hear that there's a new person in. You take a look at their notes. You see what the injury is. You see if there's any CT or MRI scans that give you some indication of what happened within their skull, to give you some sense of what we're going to look in. And I walk into the door almost predicting what kind of symptoms I think there might be. So there'll be certain areas of the brain, if they have something on the left side in this middle area, that be considered, let's say, a temporal lobe injury that might be affecting language. I'll know that. I can see it on the chart. I'll know in there, knowing that it's very possible that that patient won't be able to speak to me clearly or won't be able to understand me clearly. So I'm going to approach them in a different way. There will be different areas of, you know, the executive functioning in the frontal lobes, of the occipital lobe and vision in the back, parietal lobes of spatial awareness, left and right hemisphere do different things. There's lots of different pieces here that we say, okay, this is what has happened. Now let's see what it looks like when you interact with a person. What are symptoms that you can see? What is preserved? That could be their strengths. And now with that, we can do cognitive assessment. So actually do formalized testing to really eke out those strengths and weaknesses. And then you make a plan. What are the areas that are weaker? What can we do in terms of restorative strategies or compensatory strategies, compensation, to try and move things forward? Or what unfortunately might be long lasting, and, you know, we just need to help them adapt and make changes and come to terms and adjust to their injury.
Okay, wow.
So that's our role. So it's everything from the emotional to the cognitive to understand behavioral, and then we work with the bigger team as well, because a lot of times there's a lot of, you know, that holistic thinking about that person to try and get them back into their home life. Yeah.
Wow, it's crazy because I think before I met you, I never had heard of neuropsychology, and I don't think I appreciated how important it is. And maybe the world doesn't appreciate how important it is until obviously maybe, unfortunately, you're in that position, which is very interesting.
I think there's not really that many of us. I think
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's a great field, and there are definitely, I mean, it's a long road. So you often are a doctoral level clinical psychologist, and then you do specialty training postdoctorally in clinical neuropsychology. There is a registrar with the BPS for clinical neuropsychologists, or there are people who have done the different master's level, postgraduate diplomas from some of the major universities after their doctoral degree that get accreditation in that. So it's a long road. There's not a load, but I think it's really important. But again, what I'm trying to bring is just saying that's where you would encounter me, is after head injury. So what if we try to shift so that actually neuropsychology does become a little bit more known across the population, so that the messages and the understanding is not just for what we learn after the brain's been damaged, but what do we need to know about now?
Yeah, it's very important. And I've got some interesting questions for you later on. So, you know, from your years of studying people's brains and working with your patients, how does our brain determine our behavior and actions? It's a loaded question, isn't it?
That's 3 years of study right there. How does it? Okay. The number one thing that I think is important for everybody to understand is that the brain and body work together. They are one system. They are not separated the way that we like to simplify things. The universe is the brain is the most complex thing in the universe. Incredibly complex. We still don't know loads about how it's actually functioning. But we do believe it is a predictive machine. So it is learning. And I think one of the more major breakthroughs in the past recent decades is that we used to think that that the brain was shaped and developed and it kind of stopped, making new connections and changing shape in our mid-20s or so.
Yeah.
And we now learn that that's not the case, that because of something called neuroplasticity, plastic is in malleable, moldable. So neuroplasticity means that the brain's always molding and changing and taking shape based off of what we encounter and what it learns that it needs to know in order to have us survive. So through all that, the most important thing is that the brain is there to keep us safe, to keep us surviving. And it will always be changing and adapting and learning in order to deal with what it has encountered.
Okay. Interesting.
That's hope. That is hope, because that means that we will always be able to alter our brain. We will always be able to make change. We will always be able to become somebody who we want to be.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. When you were saying it, I wasn't thinking that. That's interesting. I wasn't thinking that part. But let me let you continue and we can touch on that.
The reason I say that is because, I just had a 91-year-old patient who's just saying, you're not going to, change an old dog.
Yeah, they always say that, old dog tricks and that saying, yeah.
And absolutely you can. Now there's no doubt that there will be periods of time in brain development where you're more primed to take on specific types of learning. And that we do know that an older brain will be harder to shift or change. And that there is natural age-related decline in certain areas like memory and speed of processing. But there's also age-related kind of increasing, like our vocabulary and our information continues to grow and grow as we get older.
Yeah.
So, it's not all downhill. It's not all negative. And yeah, I think that's why I say that. It's just that people will often say, well, I've been doing a habit or I've been doing it this way for so many years. I can never unbreak that. It's too stuck. And actually, that's just a mentality. That's not a fact around neurology.
Okay. I like that. And we're going to talk about the habits and breaking free. And then from your brain point of view, how does that then have that, I don't want to say control, because control just sounds like you're not control of your brain, but how does that define like what somebody does or how somebody thinks? How does that work?
Yeah. So if we think about what's happening in the brain, so the brain's made up of neurons, which is a particular type of cell. And the neurons are constantly moving around and looking for other connections. And then the more that a neuron finds another one and that they get repeated, the same kind of associations are there, you can start to build the pathways. I kind of talk about it like a path through, this is a famous one, the path through the woods. You have a well-worn path through the woods. You kind of naturally tend to want to go walk down that path. That's like a really well-worn neuronal association network, neuronal connection. You can stomp through the, thicket and make a new path. It's harder work. It takes more energy and effort, but you can do it, and eventually you will get a new worn path.
Yeah.
And that's essentially the concept of how we can make these changes.
Okay.
But what it means is that because our brain is predicting using memory and association, it primes us to be ready to act or to behave or to think or to feel in certain ways based off of cues that are around us.
Right.
Now, this is happening instantaneously, and it's definitely not happening all within our conscious awareness. When I say conscious versus unconscious, because that's a little bit of a hippie term, the idea with it is kind of the ability to think about our thinking is metacognition, to be really consciously aware as a lot of frontal lobe activity, a number of different areas within the brain are involved in us being actively aware of our thinking. And it's very energy inefficient. It is not possible for us to be taking in the amount of information that we need to be processing at any one time.
Yeah.
It's not possible. We would be constantly overwhelmed. So most of the processing that we're doing, the fact that I'm sitting right here in this chair, that I'm not kicking you with my leg, that I'm aware of sounds that are going on around me. When I focus in on it, I can start to have a lot of processing of what my body's doing and what's required of me. But I can't possibly be doing that when I'm really trying to answer your question and thinking about this at the same time. So what is happening then is that the brain is using the kind of what we call the lower areas of the brain. So I can kind of describe this in in a different way, but it's using more areas of the brain outside of just the way that we're thinking to set us up, almost like just a priming example. So let's say I walk into the kitchen. I might see a mug. Now, I might have priming across my limbs that are ready to fire to set me up to get over there to go pick up that cup of coffee or the mug and make myself a cup of coffee. So we could say, and we can see this on imaging, we can see that priming effect. And some people will say, well, then we don't have free will. Well, that's not quite the case. There's a lot of different options that the brain has primed ready for you to do that. It's just whether or not you actually then make that choice to move forward and do that thing. And sometimes we are doing it automatically, and that's where bad habits can come in. Yeah. Or sometimes we can override the priming effect and do something completely different, but that takes a lot more consciousness and energy in order to do that.
I love that. I love the path through the forest. And it made me think of another question, right? How then do you... How does that first path in the forest, and I like the example because I think it's easy for people to understand, for all to understand. How does that first path in the forest get formed? How does that happen?
Well, the first paths, they get happened when we're in the womb, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're interacting with your environment before you're born. And actually, there's lots of studies that show the effect of the maternal environment on newborn growth and development. We're really clear about that. Yeah. So that's where it starts. And then it just continues all throughout life. But it depends on what exactly we're talking about, But you can think about the environment is massive in terms of our becoming who we become. Yeah. We have genes, we have DNA, and we now know that there is so much more that comes into how those genes actually get expressed than just it being set in stone. And that's actually some of the reasons why you'll find that people do have genetic predispositions for stuff that they don't actually express, they don't actually have. And that's because there'll be environmental factors. This is molecular. It's really complex. All kinds of environmental factors, both in our external environment, but also our internal environment. What kind of microbiome we have and what kind of foods or pesticides or, antibiotics we put into our system. That will all be creating different environments internally as well that then make changes with protein and enzyme development that then might turn on and off the expression of genes in something that we call epigenetics. Now, that's kind of a whole different topic there. But it's relevant because when you ask, how does this happen? Well, there's all these really complex factors that then end up creating even what you would think would be, our gene code that should set us up.
That's wow. I feel like my mind is like being blown right now. We're not even like into the crux of the episode. So I feel like it's like you say, there's so many factors that can define who you are. And it's so interesting that we're not having more of this conversation. I think what's so great about neuropsychology is obviously psychology, you are finding out more about yourself. Well, there's certain types, I know there's different types, but like through talking, because you're trying to, let's say, solve a certain problem, right? Whereas with neuropsychology, it's like you're almost trying to understand your whole being for why you do stuff.
Yeah.
We don't have enough of that conversation. We do not speak about that enough.
I think there's probably 3 big concepts that I like to talk about. And the first one is going to be thinking about the stress response. Mm-hmm. Well, no, let's say the first one is what we've just been talking about. The idea that we're predictive learning, that our past matters because we'll have a priming effect that makes us set up to feel or think or behave in certain ways based off of what we encounter now, because we encountered it, 27 years ago when something happened and it had a really big impact and our brain learned. So that's relevant. The second is the concept of the stress response. And that's really important for people to understand what is happening when they have a thought or they have an experience or anything else that creates stress and what that means for both the body, the mind, and then what they do. And then the third is a lot of the chemicals that are, sloshing around in our system, whether they be neurotransmitters, which are chemicals within the brain, or the endocrinology system, which is our hormone system, which is within the body. These also have huge, huge factor impacting our emotion state and our behavior and our well-being in total. So those are 3 kind of areas that I really like to hit with a lot of my clients as a way to help them think about how to improve their lives and follow the goals that they're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. I wanted to talk about like the impacts, and I think you might have mentioned some before. And again, I know this is like a wide question because the damage to somebody's, brain can be so varied, right? But I mean, generally speaking, if somebody does get damage to their brain, how can that impact them? And I guess their actions too.
So that is a very wide question. You like those wide questions.
I don't want to say this very specific head injury because I don't know enough about one. I mean, I could say one, but then how? I don't want to go gory. It's not a true crime podcast.
Okay, then how about we talk about one
let's talk about one that you want to choose.
Yeah, let's talk about one that might be a little bit more possible to the listeners,
I like that,
which is concussion.
Yes, that's a good one.
So that's a big one because I think a lot of people will have either had a concussion at one point or know somebody who has, and there is a wide variety of different things that can happen with that. And concussion is supposed to mean that it is mild enough that it's not going to show up on scans. So you're not going to see any damage or injury with a CT scan or an MRI necessarily. Yeah. There is, I'll just add in there, something called diffuse axonal injury. Now, that is something else that can be really impacting that might not necessarily show up on some scans as well. Okay. And that's almost, if you can imagine that these neurons have a body and they have these long kind of like tail and then these dendrites that come out like this and connect to the next one. And that long tail can snap, basically. So that's, the diffuse axonal injury is just out of a brain kind of rattles around inside the skull. You can imagine that neuron having a compression kind of thing. That tail can get damaged, and that could be not just in one central location. It could be anywhere throughout the brain. So you've actually potentially made a lot of damage within, but it's diffuse. It's all spread out rather than something you can actually see, like on imaging. So that's neither here nor there. That's an aside. But with concussion, I think the key with that is that it's one of these difficult diagnoses where you can't really have a clarity that something's wrong because it's not that visual, but yet people feel like they've had big change. And mostly this is going to be with mood. A lot of times it's with fatigue. It'll be something called brain fog, just feeling not really clear with their thinking. It'll be changes in memory, concentration, attention, irritability is a big one. And those are pretty impactful symptoms for somebody who doesn't have anything clearly that wrong with their brain. So this is one of the things that we spend a lot of time working with people on as well. So that might be when you see a neuropsychologist, is if you're post-concussion, there's no real treatment. The treatment is just, rest. You should be better in 3 months or something. You should be better a lot sooner than that, but, it could be 3 months or so. Wow. And actually working with people to tolerate, that can be almost traumatic to go through that and to tolerate and understand. And there's huge individual differences coming out of concussion. And that's also because the brain is not disconnected from the body and from the history and from their personalities. And some people will cope a lot better than others. But if you have had a lot of stress in your life, there's an interactive effect with all of that, which means that somebody might be more prone to a harder recovery, or previous traumas, or, can't take care of themselves, or they have a worrisome attitude. There's already going to be things that will prevent them from having a recovery that will be in their favor. So neuropsychology can be a big help with that. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yes, that did. Yeah, that did. Thank you so much, and thanks for choosing an example. I didn't know which one to choose for concussion. It's great.
It's better
that's a good one.
It's better than motorcycle or
falling
falling off a ladder.
I didn't wanna...
But those are two things I will never let my children do.
Oh my.
Motorcycles or ladders.
No. My God.
Those are the big
you
ones.
must have seen some horror stories with those.
They're really common injuries. They're really, really common. Motorcycles are the worst, but ladders, you'd be surprised at how many ladder injuries there are.
Gosh, just imagining it is just making me feel so bad for people that have gone through that. Stress, right? We talked a little bit about stress, and many of us got, experience stress, whether it's in our, job, if it's like a highly pressured job, maybe in situations at home, just anywhere. I mean, on my way here, I could have got stressed because, I don't know, somebody bumped into me, for example. Not that anybody did, but so there are a lot of, there's a lot of areas that this can kind of happen. How does that have an impact on our brains? And I guess, leading on to our actions as well. How does that have an impact?
Okay, so let's define stress slightly differently. Let's call it the stress response.
Okay, I like stress response.
So the stress response is a thing. It is part of what we call the sympathetic nervous system response, and it is a way of keeping the body safe, the brain and body safe, the individual safe, by having a number of different responses internally that mostly activate fight or flight. So if you are activating the stress response, you normally have some kind of hit of adrenaline or cortisol that will then cause changes to our heart rate, to our breathing, to the way that our blood pressure is. It'll move a lot of the blood flow from our periphery, from our digestive tract. That's not needed when you're trying to run away from a tiger. You need it in your major muscle groups, and you need it in kind of your chest and your head to be able to get out of the situation. Our bodies are great at getting us into stress response, and they are great at getting us out of stress response when it's just these acute little spikes. So the parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxation response, that comes in pretty quickly afterwards, brings the whole body back down to stability. Perfect. Evolution's done its job. But we are in a society now where we get heightened like that from all kinds of threats on a very regular basis, as we all know. Now, the truth is that the stress response was meant for kind of physical threat around us in our environment. That's why we're either going to fight or flee or collapse. That's really what's supposed to happen to the threats that are triggering it. But we have this big old frontal lobe, which is different than any other animals, right? Any other species, that allows us to do what I call time shifting, which is thinking about the past and worrying about the future. And it's within the time shifting that you will start to notice that there are many, many more threats that start to creep in. And your review of that difficult conversation you had with a boss last week will cause a change in your body now, as if you need it to go fight your boss that you spoke to last week. But that's what the body's doing. It doesn't keep up with the fact that this is just a thought, or that there's a time, that is not appropriate. We're in a different context. It's responding to our thoughts all the time. It's responding to things in our environment all the time. It's responding to the triggers that we might not even consciously be aware of, because something from the past, it's using memory store to remember that maybe this might be something that we need to be, aware of and treat as a threat. So it's potential that we're having the stress response be activated again and again and again and again. And that is what we know starts to create an allostatic load, it's called. It's just that it just means that it's a wear and tear of our body system having to go through this level of activation and the energy that it consumes again and again and again.
Wow.
And then we end up with all the stress-related illnesses.
Okay.
So all of your, stroke and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity, those are metabolic diseases. We can have changes in neurology because of it. We have pain conditions. There's all kinds of different stress-related illnesses that, in fact, statistics. I said I don't know statistics, but I know, go chat GPT it. I know there's statistics out there about how much of current population is a really high number of any kind of disease and illness is almost totally down to stress-related illness. And more importantly, when you go to the doctor with symptoms, they tend to say to you, it's just stress. That can be incredibly unhelpful to people. So one of the things I really like to do is help people understand this connection, so they can understand there actually is real medical and physiological explanations for why, staying up at night worrying about your presentation is causing you heart disease down the way.
Oh my gosh.
Now, I'm saying that I don't want to scare people. That's not, we need to be aware of something, but we're not damning people to say, you're all going to have these issues. But the more we know about it, the more we can do things that try and, be preventative.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to understand the link, because I think sometimes as well that stress, I don't think we take stress seriously enough. Oh, you're just stressed. Oh, that person's just stressed. And you kind of see it as, because obviously you're dealing with it in that moment. Let's say it's like the presentation, right? You're stressed about the presentation. You go through the presentation, like, oof. But then you're doing that repeatedly, and you're kind of, you think it's normal to just, stress is having that high level of stress all the time. You just kind of normalize it, not knowing that there's going to be some issues further down the line. And I feel like in modern society, especially in a place like London, where people are very driven, I've worked for some of the biggest companies, and I know what those places are like. For me, work-life balance is important. I'm non-negotiable on that. Some people, they want to get the promotions, they want to get the money from work. So maybe for them, they're willing to compromise that. And I think they're willing to compromise that because there's that lack of awareness that actually, this could have a real impact on you. But because the impact's not like straight away, it's not like you can physically, like if you were stressed, you're going to collapse straight away, right? It's not like that. I think people kind of like, oh, whatever, I can deal with it,
So now we're complicating the picture here, because what you are saying at this point, which is a really important factor, we start to think about why do people put themselves in position. So yes, maybe it could be complete lack of awareness. Your body will normalize to something. So it will just assume what's required of it, even though it is creating quite a load, and suddenly we end up with symptoms and we're unaware. But also, why are those guys, and females, really pushing to get to the top of something? Why are they so competitive? Why are they driven by the cash or the finance or whatever? And again, that's when we start to think about what are the schemas or ways that people see the world around them. And that comes from their historical experiences. So that often is coming from what the brain has learned over time. It's what's required of them, what the world is like, who other people are to them, what they need to do. So again, you often, when you sit down and really go through therapy and start exploring with people who are putting themselves in this position, why are they doing this? You start to find some meaning that's made that creates that motivation and drive that might be born out of even trauma or coping, or this is a way to be seen and to get recognition, or you get the really good feeling that you never really got in the past when you have a boss say, that's a great job. That means something. It fills a hole or a gap. And so these are just examples, but this is how we can start to say that it's not just as simple as this is stressful, you got to stop it. People are so motivated to be in certain ways and act in certain things, and they learn it over time and it becomes habitual, but often it's come from some learning and some reason.
It's such an important conversation, honestly, having this and thinking about this is like you say, it's like everything is linked. So I'll see if I've got time at the end to ask another question, because I definitely want to move us on, because I know there's a lot of other questions that I definitely want us to, discuss, right?
And this was the short question list.
This is a short version. I think one day I'm going to let the watchers and viewers know like my process of writing questions. It's just crazy for people, to know. So I wanted to have an understanding, right, of, you mentioned that we can kind of almost, change ourselves, right? So why is it though, that even though we have all the ability, right, to achieve something, we tell ourselves we can't do it? Why do we think this? And I guess, how can one overcome this?
Are you somebody who thinks that?
I think sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes I think I can't achieve certain things sometimes, but then I have to tell myself, no, I can. I can do it. But I would say I'm more of a person that just does. I'm more of a doer, which is interesting. I think I realized that more about myself. I'm just going to do it. Whether I believe it or not, I'm just going to do it and then see what happens. But yeah, sometimes I do.
Well, that was almost kind of a trick question, because it was just, even within yourself, exploring, again, the complexity and the variables involved. So actually, you said, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'm able to alter myself out of a certain mindset. And there's other times where I'm not even thinking. I'm just taking on. And again, that's the complexity that we're working with here. And actually, it's a really nice thing to say, I'm somebody who just can't get things done. That's simply a automatic self-belief. That's a limiting self-belief. And it's a mindset, potentially nothing to do with reality. It might just be something that somebody has believed in themselves over time, that they've learned. They've maybe even heard this message externally and started to internalize it over time. And it may not be true, because they might actually do completely the opposite and other people see it that way. But they've never been able to truly adapt to current context, because the brain is still stuck with old messaging, and that they might be trying to outrun it, or overcompensate for it by being that guy that can never stop getting the next goal and achieve the next thing. And it could be sitting here right now saying the exact same thing. I just can't really. Why can't I just do it? Yet the evidence is the opposite. Or people fall into it and they just resign. And that's a whole different way of coping with something like that. You just become resigned to this message that was given you. So there's definitely many, many ways that people end up learning about themselves and the world around them. And then how they cope with that, you end up creating personality structures.
Yeah. And so let's use an example. Let me use myself, because I don't mind using myself as an example. Let's say I said I don't think I can achieve big things with this podcast, right? And I tell myself that, right, on a constant basis. And let's say I'm not. Let's assume I'm not doing the podcast, although we are recording it. Let's say I wanted to always use this podcast. I can't achieve things, and I don't take any action, right? What can I do practically to kind of start to shift that thinking, essentially?
Mm-hmm. One of the first things is to really align with your motivation. What's the motivation? Is it that you truly believe what it is that you want to achieve?
Yeah.
Or is it that actually you're chasing the Instagram dream, society's, goal for us all? Or is it that, it's just about finance or something that there's a difference when you are really aligned from your true self with what you're trying to do as a goal. And this is, let's move to another very common one.
Yeah.
I want to lose 10 pounds.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, why? What are we doing this for? Why are we trying to make a hard change? And what is it that we have that's controllable versus what isn't? That's another big one too.
Yeah.
So I think the 10 pounds thing is a really important one, because you'll hear a lot of people talk about, I just need to lose 10 pounds. And then what? Then life is going to be amazing. All my problems will be solved. Of course, we know that this isn't true. And the first step is actually, what is it that we really are getting from the losing of the 10 pounds? Is it because there's a cardiovascular condition and your doctor said, get this weight off because it's going to make a big difference for your breathing, in which case there might be a lot more motivation than I simply want to look, like the girls who are 22. Big change, because that societal pressure doesn't have the meaning.
Yeah.
But then from that, once we almost have a true identity with something, think about the concept of losing 10 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
It is much, much more than, what do you have to do to lose 10 pounds?
A lot, yeah.
It's not just, we're not talking about one goal.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually talking about what? Changing eating behaviors, changing what we eat, changing when we eat, exercise, how much exercise, how difficult is it? How much have we done before? How much have we aligned with the concept? And, things like family system. Do other people want you to lose 10 pounds?
Yeah.
Are they going to be barriers? Are they going to be cheerleaders? And are you going to be going out with friends who are always wanting you to drink and eat and be merry? And in doing so, you have all these different things that are going to be, so that's not a good habit to change. This idea of that's not a habit. We need to develop, what is the habit? What are we going to try and move? And because we know that the brain's predictive and that's energy efficient, we need to make a clear, identifiable goal that we align with. It's truly for us. And we simplify it down to decide what is one small change that we can make. And we start practicing that. Okay. So actually, which one are we going to pick? Which one of all those different options are we going to pick?
Out of the 5 options.
Yeah.
Change our eating, let's say that.
Okay, great.
Okay, yeah.
Now, if we really think about that, we know that the microbiome is filled with bacteria that's keeping us going. And actually, in order to change our eating habits, there's a lot of new research that says that we have to actually grow our microbiome. We have different bacteria that crave sugar. So if you find yourself really wanting sugar, throughout the day or at the end of the evening or anything else, it might be because you have bacteria that's sending messages to the brain that it needs its food source. So that creates us wanting to seek that, because that's how the brain, microbiome, that whole communication system works. Okay. So one of the best ways to do it is to be growing it by adding nutrients. So it might be that the first thing we need to do, and this is what Tim Spector from Zoe talks about all the time, is adding food in, adding fruits and vegetables, plants, adding plants. The more plants you're adding, the more you're increasing your microbiome so that different nutrients are being taken in. And in doing so, you actually feel better, and you might start to change. So these sugar bacteria, for instance, are kind of getting starved, and then you're not craving things so much.
Wow.
But so that's a whole different area. But again, that's important for people to know that they're up against this, but these are the ways that they can make change rather than just deciding I'm not going to have any sugar at all. Because that's what you hear.
That's probably me.
Right? But that's what
And
people
I failed at that.
And that's what happens. So what happens when you tuck into chocolate cake? How do you feel then?
I guess you probably feel bad because you're like, oh, I've not met my goal. Oh, I'm failing.
Yeah, exactly.
What can you do about
so
it?
that's what we really try and work with people about it, is that there's another piece here, is having flexibility with your goals. We know that the brain takes a lot of energy in order to make habits. So when you're tired, when you're sick, when you're really stressed by things externally, you are less likely to be able to do that new thing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you can't do it or that you failed or that there's no point. That's some of that mindset that I'm never going to do it. Yeah. Instead, it's about getting back into it the next morning. Every new moment is a new moment to try again if you're truly aligned to what that goal is. Okay. And we give ourselves the compassion and the flexibility to not be able to do it all the time because we understand how hard it is for our brains to need that extra energy in order to make that change. So that's compassion.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate the fact that you literally just said, there's so many points that I'm not going to go off on that. I really agree with. I love the part that you said about the microbiomes. Is that what you said? Microbiome? I don't really know much about that, but it was so interesting to me. And it really hones in on your point of how the body and the mind are together, right? In that example, you just clearly highlighted that. And I really like the fact that you said that you should just keep on trying, because I think actually when I was thinking about it in that example of, like, let's say giving up on sugar, it's 0 or 100 how we are with things. It's okay, we try, we fail, okay, we're not going to try again, instead of repeatedly trying. That's a very interesting point. And we were talking offline, right, about this whole 66 days of forming a new habit. It came, I saw it on James Clear. We're not approving or disproving it, but so that repeated of trying a habit, is that a way for people to really stick to it? Because I think by the time people hear this, people are going to start be thinking about New Year resolution. You know what's going to happen. New Year's resolution. I want to lose weight. I want to save X amount. I want to earn this in my business. I want to do this career. A lot of that's going to be happening, right? And I know people have a lot of energy at the start of the year. So is that a way to, to really try to develop your new habit?
So one of the best things about a habit is you're trying to make it automatic. So once it gets to that automaticity, that's a word I can never pronounce right. What that's just saying is that it's not it's not driving the same energy to be consciously aware and try and override old habits, because it's become automatic, and that takes a certain amount of time. And that study came from a UCL study that was James Clear's notes, and it basically just said that actually there's quite a big variety, and there's all kinds of different factors that can influence whether or not how quickly somebody can adapt a new habit. But when we're talking about New Year's resolutions, one of the things that I say to people is take whatever that resolution is, and I want you to break it down into 5, 10, 15 steps. So if you were to take that, job promotion or the 10 pounds or, whatever the thing might be in the New Year's resolution hot box, take whatever that is and actually start to break it down into smaller goals that you can see progression. Because what you're doing is you're trying, instead of just that no sugar thing, or just, suddenly exercising 5 days a week, we want to think about how are we starting to train our brain and our body to find something a little bit more automatic that we just then keep building upon over time. So the New Year's resolution should be for the end of the year, and you should be able to think about how you could break down that resolution to as many small steps as possible that are simple, that are specific, and that are truly aligned with what you really want for a real reason. And the other thing is that if it means letting go of some bad habits, I always ask somebody, how does that habit serve you? What has it done that's helpful?
Yeah.
You will never be able to break it unless you truly understand how it helps. And people don't like that. They're like, but it doesn't. Me stuffing my face with Doritos at 10 o'clock on the couch is not a helpful thing, but it must be. There must be a reason that the brain has adopted this as something that's going to have helped at some point. So what is it? And if you haven't been able to really think about how that's a good thing and find ways to replace that need, you're not necessarily going to be able to get rid of the bad habits. It's very difficult to just cut something out without having something else that potentially suits. So even if it's just, I'm lonely at that time, my partner's gone up to bed, I find myself just kind of sitting there, my mind starts to go, and actually eating something is just a distraction. Well, okay, that's great. We can now work with changing that behavior because we know that we need to somehow do something else that addresses concepts of loneliness or an overactive mind or a poor bedtime routine. Maybe changing something like that and working on that as the habit change will inadvertently change the other bad habit of overeating at 10 o'clock, and suddenly we're on our path to losing 10 pounds.
Interesting. I have a poor bedtime routine. I need to fix that. It's so interesting you said
New
that.
Year's resolution coming up.
That has got to definitely be. How do I break that down into 15 steps? What do I do? Do I Monday I try 7 p.m. and the other days I don't know, sleep at 1 a.m.
Well, no, but there would be a lot of potential factors of why it is that. So again, we'd have to be spending some time of why is the bedtime routine bad? Is it because of other people who are involved in it somehow and obligations? Is it because you've created a wonderful space to do your work at 11:30 at night?
Yeah.
Is it because you spend too much time trying to just turn your mind off and scroll or do some mind numbing with TV and Netflix or something else? This is where we're starting to get at what are the specifics that are the bad habits that you need.
Yeah.
And how do we then start to make some changes there and that's part of those, you could get easily 15 steps if we really think through all those things potentially.
Amazing. So I wanted to talk about this whole energy that people have with, sticking on a New Year's resolution. We have a lot of motivation at the beginning of the year and it kind of peters out. Why do you think that kind of happens? This, a lot of energy, like if we stay with the losing weight example, yes, I'm going to do it. Even like an example of January, let me even use 30 days where people no drink January, stuff like that. People, have these very arbitrary, kind of situations. Why does that happen? That we have all of this energy towards the beginning of the year, and then slowly but surely kind of just disappears.
Well, I think, again, the association piece, January is the time that everybody says, this is when, I'm going to start, which actually is really surprising. Like, why isn't it July or, and sometimes you'll get it in September, right? When people are starting school years and things. So there's just some times of year that are almost just closely paired with somebody feeling like, okay, this is a new start time. So that's the first bit. Dopamine. Dopamine is all about goal-directed behavior. We get big dopamine hits when we're planning to go through steps to achieve something. Now, we can definitely use that in our favor. And I think one of the things that James Clear talks about too is the concept of rewarding success, because we need to have another dopamine hit by expecting a reward. Most of the New Year's resolutions we set are actually not that rewarding very quickly. People do set a lot of poor goals or woolly ones or ones that, again, aren't really that meaningful truly. And then they don't see change that quickly. You see memes that are really funny about, like, I'm going to, lose 10 pounds and I've gone into the treadmill for 3 minutes and nothing's happened. And, there isn't the reward, the intrinsic reward. The intrinsic reward is the reward we truly feel when we've achieved something. And actually we can harness that. But a lot of times having some kind of pairing of an additional reward somehow can really help with keeping that sense of motivation going. But I guess this is where I say about the breaking down of goals is because people set unrealistic ones and then easily get discouraged because they can feel not on the right path, even though they probably are.
Yeah.
In fact, I really love, just for those who haven't actually come across it, and I think it was in his book, the idea of the ice cube changing. Do you know what the...
No, I feel like
Do you know
if
this
you
one?
explain it? Yeah.
I
explain it,
love
please.
this metaphor. I think it's so nice. It's the concept that we put in energy and effort for things and we don't necessarily see change. And the analogy was that an ice cube will continue to look exactly the same as heat is applied up until the point of 0 degrees Celsius, when suddenly there's an alteration.
Yeah.
But, between -10 and -2, it looks exactly as it does.
Okay.
So even though heat's being applied to make all that change in temperature slowly, gradually, it takes just something where suddenly you can finally see the results of all that effort. So if we're at -10 going to -4 and we give up because we have no other motivation, we don't have any reward set, we're not really aligned with it, we had no idea that there was change being made.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I like that ice cube. I feel like I've heard
Have you heard that before?
I feel like it's amazing. It's an amazing way to think about it, because it's absolutely right. It's almost like it's I see growth in so many weird ways. I like to use my podcast because it's very similar. Like, the podcast steadily grew over the first 2 years, and then in the third year it really shot up. It's almost similar to the ice cube, like very steady. Maybe the ice cube steadily melted, probably can't see anything, and then before you know it, it's melted. And that's kind of what happened from the podcast. So I kind of see it in that way. Resilience, right? Resilience is quite important, especially if you are looking to, pursue your goals. So even if, the odds are stacked against you, how can somebody train themselves to be a bit more resilient, right?
You know what? I really struggle with... So I should just have as an aside, one of the things I find really difficult are a lot of the oversimplifications that you'll find when you're just out there, in the media world, like 5 tips for reducing anxiety, or, I find that the concept of resilience means that people are able to have self-awareness of what's going on in their mind, in their body. They can have an understanding of when they get triggered and why. They will note that they might have more extreme reactions to certain things than other people might, and be curious in themselves about why that happens, to make some understanding or find ways to search for healing. They'll feel more capable of having stressful experiences and knowing how to work with their mind and their body to help bring that system back down again. They'll put in habits. That means that they can prioritize mind and body health and all of those pieces. And they'll do things like, really focus in on social engagement and interaction and being outside and having the sky and, seeing the sky is such an important part of our well-being. So I don't have a simple answer of how does somebody build resilience. There's many, many, many pieces. But it's, I think, most importantly, the way that people will handle tough things. Not that they don't have tough things, not that they don't have stress, but when they do, they feel confidence that they will be able to manage that and return back to a baseline state.
Yeah, amazing. So it's almost like finding out what are those things that can help you get to a baseline state. And it's not just one thing, it can be many things.
Definitely. And also be really wary of those things that say these 5 tips to do this or that. Because I think these are such great ways for people to feel self-blame and shame. And that's why I've always just worried about, people feel like, well, no, those 5 things didn't work for me. So I'm hopeless. And that's what we want to just argue against. There's so much more complexity.
Okay. So it's like being fair to yourself, right? If you've not hit your goal, if you've not, I don't know, you want to change your eating and you've messed up today, it's not about beating yourself up. It's about, okay, I'll try again, right? And it's repeatedly trying to reinforce those messages, or obviously being kind to yourself to kind of get there?
I love the beating yourself up one, because people always are saying, why? So why do you beat yourself up? Oh, because I guess it motivates me. Okay. What about your, 9-year-old son? Is that the way that you motivate him?
Ooh,
so
crazy.
Why is there such a difference? It's so extreme, it's so extraordinary. Of course, that's not how you motivate.
Yeah.
So why do we do it to ourselves? Somewhere along the way, it worked at some point, or it was actually the messages that were given to us were highly critical and they stung more. So, we tried harder to avoid them and escape them, and then end up in this self-critical cycle. So actually, the truth is, the more self-critical we are, the more likely we are to turn to quick and easy and bad self-soothing habits, because we are overwhelmed and feeling really ashamed.
You know what? I definitely want to stay on this subject, because this, honestly, you might get rid of all the motivational speakers. I'm kidding. There are some motivational speakers that are positive and not self-critical, and I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned that, because I think that actually, is there a time where being self-critical is okay, or is it, nah, let's not ever do that?
I think the defining self-critical, self-reflective,
okay,
very important.
Yes.
Okay. So again, the criticism comes in a more maybe analytical or rational or objective way, as opposed to a shaming and punishing way. So being able to look at something and be able to identify errors and ways to improve, and, what didn't go right, and to learn, all of that is essential. Why does it need to be angry or aggressive?
Yeah.
In what way is that going to be where somebody truly argues that's the best way?
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true, because I feel like the motivation, not all of it, but some of the motivation out there may come across in that way, like, you're lazy, you're this, you're that, to motivate you. But actually, like you say, that will lead you to like a short-term fix instead of a long-term fix of understanding, actually what you want to do. Is it really for you? Do you want to do it for you, or is it for something else, right?
Well, this becomes are you working towards your goal, or are you working to avoid criticism? So which one is taking your focus?
Yeah.
If we're trying not to be lazy, how is that helping your podcast succeed? That's where the energy is focused on, and that's not actually the real aligning with what you were truly working on.
Yeah.
And getting all the natural, again, intrinsic reward of feeling like you're moving forward with something that's meaningful, instead of just trying to avoid something negative.
I've just remembered the question I wanted to ask you. It's about the association. Yes, that was it. So this association that we have with January being the time where we're ready for, everything's gonna, be good, and it's gonna be new year, new me. How does that? You might have answered it before, but I just want to guess. Want to double down on it. How does that association happen? And the reason why I'm asking is because I want to know how people can kind of form their own, let's say, positive association, so it can kind of drive them towards whatever they're trying to achieve.
January is a funny one. It's a funny time of year. So let's think about January, when it's the darkest, when it's the coldest, when we are all broke, when we are all exhausted. We have just spent so much, time and energy and gluttony and all the things that have been happening right before it. And we wonder why we don't necessarily stick with these brand new shiny goals. Nobody has social plans. Everybody's staying home and disconnected. There's nothing that actually is necessarily supporting our success with making change. It's really difficult to go out and see the sky when you only can between the hours of 10 and 2 or something. It's January is a really tough time of year. There's a true seasonal affective disorder issue that's out there. It's real that we are very much affected by light. So taking that extra energy that's required to make these big changes, we're up against it in January. So, another piece of just having people think about it and be considerate of it and being compassionate to themselves. But again, let's not try and hit the gym 5 times in a month. Let's do something that starts to help our body and our brain actually like the concept of maybe starting to move it a bit more. Our brains can start to help us along the way. If you just are able to just decide, well, actually, yes, getting out and seeing the sky because I really desperately need to see some form of sunlight in January, that would be a better way. Let's devote just a 10, 15 minute getting outside, having to walk around the block every lunchtime. That's better than I'm going to hit the gym 5 times a week when I've never put on running shoes before. That's much more of an easier one that the brain starts to adapt to. And then you build to get to 5 times a week by the end of the year.
Okay, cool. And then I guess, how does the association happen? Is that how that association happens? By you doing...
I didn't answer your question.
No, that's fine. No, it's fine. I love that, because that's still helping us like create new habits and break free from old ones, right? But yeah, how does that association happen? Like with that, for example,
I guess it goes back to the original concept of these neuronal pathways. So again, the best way to describe it is when you, for example, everybody has the experience of walking down steps and getting that thud because you have missed a step or, doing that wrong. Yeah. That's because your brain's you're not paying attention, but your whole body's moving. It's actually doing quite a complex process. It's able to notice the difference between each step and set your legs to be able to have the right balance and movement throughout while you are completely checked out, scrolling on your phone or whatever else you're doing, right? That's all kind of associated. It's the brain has been taking in all this information. It's preparing and priming the next step and we're not aware of it. And this is what can happen when, let's say you and I walk into a massive room filled with people. And you and I can have a very different internal experience walking into that room based off our separate experiences. That's an associative network where the brain is quickly taking all the sensory information that comes in through our senses, goes up the spinal cord, goes into an area called the limbic system that releases. That's limbic system is where all of our memory stores are. The hippocampus involved in our memory and all our sensory processing and our chemical release, and sets us up to be able to engage the way that previously it has learned would be a good way to engage or to feel. Could cause a panic response in me and you say, right, let's go have some fun,
Love that. Thank you so much. So this was the question. There's 2 that I wanted to ask you that I asked you before, right? So one was, we talked about a healthy, and I keep on doing quotation marks because I might be pronouncing it or saying it wrong, right? But from your point of view, as a neuropsychologist, what does a well-functioning, healthy brain look like versus one that isn't as healthy?
You know what? I don't really think that I kind of categorize it quite like that. Unhealthy brains are the ones that have been, really impaired in some way. And then there's a whole spectrum of ways with which our brain changes and is shaped and has toxins that are in it. One of the big concepts is inflammation. Inflammation in the brain is a thing that we are seeing, we are starting to understand in a way we thought inflammation was kind of only in the body. But there's a work of Monty Lyman talks about the immune mind and starts talking about how there's actually an immune system and an inflammation system that happens within the central nervous system. And that's going to have all kinds of impact on our cognition and functioning. A lot of times that could be reversible. But we know that there's disease processes. We know that there's a role of toxins like alcohol and, different drugs and substances that will be altering that. And we know that there's natural age-related decline in certain areas and what they call atrophy, which is these neurons just dying out in their connections. And that can just happen because of genetic predisposition or a whole host of other factors. So I think most people should be just assuming that they have a healthy brain.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
you just want to be thinking, are you keeping it? What kind of additional, factors and variables are you adding to it that might not keep it there longer
Okay.
term?
And what are examples of that? Because that was my other question that I wanted to ask you earlier.
Yeah.
You know what? I actually had, I had initially wrote in brackets some things. So you know what? Let me call them out because I think it'll make it easier. Alcohol, what kind of impact does that have?
We know it has impacts.
Yeah, it has. There's an impact on the brain, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Again, what you're doing when you drink is you're increasing you're decreasing the amount of oxygen. You're creating something called like a small hypoxic event. So that's the feel good, is that we're not giving our brain the oxygen it needs, which is why you end up in kind of that high feeling. That's not great.
So many of us do it. It's so crazy.
Exactly.
I didn't know it was like that. So that's what we're doing. We're starving our brain of oxygen. That's so cruel.
And actually, it does seem that our brains and our bodies are really hardy, but this is where abuse over time comes. And there's certain, diseases of neurology, Wernicke's encephalopathy, Wernicke-Korsakoff's. These are different, purely alcohol-induced neurological conditions that happen when people just drink too much.
Gosh. Oh my God. You know what? That sounds so cruel to do that to ourselves. I mean, if we could see the impact like on a video and by drinking alcohol, this is all I think a lot more people would stop.
I bet that happens because we have something called biofeedback, which is, the way that our watches are monitoring our heart rates. And I'm sure in time we'll be able to see that kind of thing in live events. Probably.
Although having said that, I mean, on smoking packets, you see, it's got the whole lungs thing. People buying that in droves. So, it's so interesting. Okay, cool. I wanted to talk about drive, right? Towards the end of the podcast, right? So, and it's kind of linked to, you mentioned before that people can kind of change themselves, right? Some people are already driven, right? This is a two-part question. Why is it that some people seem more driven than others? And two, how can you make yourself more driven?
So a big part, so we talked about dopamine, but that really isn't a very important understanding. We have a chemical that has been created over time that is for the purpose of getting things that we need for survival of our species. So whether that's food, whether that's sex, whether that's shelter, whether that's social connection, because being in a tribe is really important. I was going to mention that about stress. One of the things that we get very stressed by is feeling like we are going to be kicked out of the tribe, because that would be detrimental to our safety. And that's now become getting enough likes on Facebook, or, having work-related stress because of all the implications. So the social aspect and the tribe element is a huge part of our stress and our seeking system. So dopamine is there for seeking. So it means that we get a reward feeling. We get a really nice, pleasant feeling when we feel like we're getting a reward for something, or we think we're going to. Classic is pressing the OK on the Amazon button and then getting that excitement feeling while you're waiting for the box to come. And then as soon as the box comes, you go, and you do it again. That's a classic dopamine kind of response. But the other thing it does is that it helps create that drive feeling, that pleasant feeling about setting things up and getting things moving so that you feel goal oriented to achieve that reward. Can you harness it? I mean, of course you can harness, but you need to do so by thinking about how to use that chemical. How are you focusing on doing things that feel reward-based, that feel like they have the clear direction, that you're noticing and celebrating when you do have small achievements. And there will definitely be personality features, natural. Some people are going to have had more rewarding experiences in the past to be able to reinforce this system so that it's more readily usable, and people are more motivated to have more drive and achievement because it's been rewarded, or because they have a genetic predisposition, or because they're in a family system where it was really focused on, so it becomes much more of an identity, or they have a goal that is just so important to them that none of the rest of that mattered. It's just that they believe in something and it becomes a passion and an interest. They wake up every day wanting to do it.
Yeah. Wow. That's so interesting. So if somebody isn't as driven, how can they apply that to themselves? That's what I'm thinking, because I know a lot of people, again, watching and listening, they listen because they want and watch because they want to change their lives in some shape or form. And I understand that. So yes, the question is really for them, actually. Yeah.
Well, I think
and
it
for
is.
me, probably too.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think this is not a question for me as much as a question for the individual in the audience.
Yeah.
Is there something that you want to alter? And again, going back to, does it have a purpose and a function that makes it hard to let go of? Yeah. Is it helpful to not push yourself too much, because actually it might be dangerous within your partnership to try and get ahead, or maybe it's not something that you can do within your current social circle, or there's lots of different reasons why there might be something that prevents just wanting to be better or to drive or to make change. So let's first look at what those things are, because they could make a big difference. Second, are you trying to drive towards something you actually want to drive towards?
Yeah. Okay.
Are you truly passionate? Yeah. Are you truly finding something that, is it just the idea of it would be great to have a better job? Or is it actually, I know that I love doing this and I wish I could do this more and I want to put this more into my day? There'll be very different drives that happen between people listening from those two concepts.
Love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Amber. So I've got this question for you, right? How do people learn more about their brains? Because I think this was a very important conversation, and I feel like I've learned so much. So how do people learn more so that they can I think we've given some great tips on how to establish new habits, how to understand the habits that you have. Actually, let me ask you that question. How do you understand that? The habits that you have, actually? That's an interesting question. Yeah. How do you understand what's like something that you kind of just do for you to really identify, okay, maybe this is something I need to change, right? As well. Or want to change. Not need to, want to change.
Well, I guess, what's important about that question is to recognize that everybody probably does a lot of really good things. They probably, we really focus in on bad habits. And actually sometimes when we are stressed and we're ill and we're exhausted and we know that it's going to be harder to create new habits, one of the tips is to instead just focus more on the good habits that we already have, and just focus on them and do them a little bit more if we can, rather than trying to make big change, because that's harder when we're exhausted and our resources are down. So I guess, how do you answer that question? I mean, it's really about self-awareness. Where are people noticing that they're getting stuck? And then what are they noticing that actually seems to get them on track? What can they find from people around them that actually might help elucidate a little bit more? What are the things that are working well, or where could there be some areas of improvement? A lot of times you can find that within yourself. If you're truly giving yourself some space and some time to be reflective, to journal, to be mindful, to just give some time to really think about growth and change and what you want, I think most people are able to find at least the beginnings of some area that could go for it. I think it becomes more complicated when we start asking, why is this bad habit good for you? And what does it come from? And I think that can lead to a lot of complexity. And again, that's why, the concept of therapy is there. Therapists often work with people who want behavior change. And sometimes we have to dig through a lot of the other stuff to help get us there. I guess it's part of the answer to that question.
Yeah.
You know, where do you look? I mean, there's lots and lots of popular science books. I love reading these things. I find them just so fascinating. It's better than novels to me because it's all real science. And then TED Talks, go to TED Talks. TED Talks are great.
I need to listen to more TED Talks, definitely.
They're fun. And I think that the podcast scene, the health and well-being in podcast scene has really taken off, hasn't it, in the past 5 years or so.
Yeah.
So definitely just start exploring what's out there, really.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Amber. I learned so much from you. We had more questions, so I'm going to leave that for part 2 because I think part 2, I want to see what the response is, see what questions people have, and then we can, obviously there might even be more areas that you want to discuss in the future as well. Where can people find you if they want to, connect with you, they want to seek you out?
Yeah. So let me just say about that I run Healthy Mind Psychology, and we are a collection, I think it's about 28 doctoral level psychologists at the moment, and we do lots and lots of online work. We find online work is a wonderful way to be able to reach a specialist who is truly matched with your needs, that isn't just somebody down the street. And we know how difficult it is to find a good provider, especially to find a qualified provider. So that's a really important part of when you're seeking help. So www.healthymindpsychology.co.uk, that's the website. I have a lot of free resources on there, actually. So there's a lot of things that people can look through. I have a book of the month. I have blogs. If you're starting to get interested in some of this, by all means, go check out the resources and the freebies and that kind of stuff on the website. And that might be a way to get a bit further into it. And also you can find me on Instagram, I don't know, at Healthy Mind Psychology UK. I think that might be it.
we'll put the details in
Go
the description of the episode. It's all right. It's all right. I checked the website. Like, it's what you're doing there is amazing. And the team, when I was looking at the team, I was like, wow, this team is huge. It's big.
It's just about making community.
Yeah.
So this is just, I know every one of the clinicians, and it's about just making sure that when somebody comes to us and they say what they're struggling with, we're able to say, well, we think we have a really good fit. To me, I thought that was a real problem that people found, is that they're inundated with different possibilities of who to go to, and it's so impossible to try and know how to pick. So we wanted to try to create some of that matching service for clients.
Amazing.
So that they had a little bit more reassurance.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Amber. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate all the knowledge you shared with us, all the helpful tips. Hopefully, if people are listening to this for New Year's resolution, hopefully that can help you in your New Year's resolution and helps you to achieve your goal. But if you don't quite achieve it, I like the fact that you said be kind to yourself, because I think that's very, very important. It's not about self-punishment. It's almost like thinking about you're climbing a mountain. Think of it in that way, but just do it quite slowly, but also be kind of happy on the journey. Don't be too, you did bad today, or what's wrong with you? That's not the right way to do things. So, with that being said, do you have any final words for the watchers and listeners?
I guess just on that point, if you find yourself struggling with that goal, break it down more. That's your sign. That's your sign that it was probably just too far out of reach at this moment. Break it down into something that feels more achievable, get some consistency behind it, and then reintroduce that goal back again. Yeah.
Amazing. That's your final word?
Well, I don't know.
No, I'll give you your final word.
Mind. Think about, they're one system. Think about it as one thing, that we have to be really conscious of how our brain and our mind are working together to keep us safe, to keep it, and that is going to be driving all the struggles that we face. So self-compassion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amber. Lovely to have you today. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the podcast. See you next week's episode.